So once again, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar, the CMMC rule, the what, when, and how for defense contractors is presented today by NeoSystems, FutureFeed, and PreVeil. I'm Don Carnevale, Marketing Director at NeoSystems, and I'll be your host for today's presentation. Now I'd like to hand off today to our moderator, Stuart Itkin, Senior Vice President at NeoSystems. Stuart?
Hey, Don, thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. By now, I'm sure that all of you are aware of the CMMC 2.0 proposed rule, which arrived as a late Christmas gift on December 26th, 2023. Some of you may have actually read all of the proposed rules, 234 riveting pages. There's been a lot written about what's in the proposed rule, how what's in the proposed rule differs from what we expected, and how CMMC 2.0 differs from CMMC 1.0. There have been several webinars that have addressed the same content. Our objective today is not to focus on what's in the proposed rule, but rather to discuss how what's in the proposed rule will affect you and will affect your business. Next slide, please, Don. My name is Stuart Itkin, and I'm Senior Vice President at NeoSystems, a managed service provider focused on serving the government contracting community. Formerly Vice President of CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance at Coalfire Federal, and Vice President of Product Management at ExoStar, I've been focused on compliance and risk management solutions for the DoD supply chain and actively involved in the CMMC program since its inception. With me today are Jim Gopal and Noel Vestal. Jim is the Director of Education and Content at FutureFeed.co, where he brings a broad range of legal, technical, and business expertise to the team. He's a founding director and former board treasurer of the CMMC accreditation body, what is now called the Cyber AB. Jim is a CMMC provisional instructor, a CMMC provisional assessor, a certified CMMC professional, and a certified CMMC assessor. Jim also authored and taught the Cyber AB's initial registered practitioner program and is the author of the book CUI Fundamentals, 100 Questions and Answers about the United States government's Controlled Unclassified Information Program. Noel Vestal is the compliance officer at PreVeil, an end-to-end encrypted email and file storage cloud solution. Noel has spent over 15 years working in IT program management with various agencies, both in the Department of Defense and other government organizations. Noel also managed successful CMMC implementation efforts for small and medium businesses in the DIB and is a certified CMMC professional. So Jim, Noel, thank you for joining me today. Don, the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our focus today is not what's in the proposed rule, but rather how does what's in the proposed rule affect you and your business? So specifically, Jim is going to provide a context for our discussion by providing an overview of the proposed rule. Next, I'm going to review the CMMC 2.0 rollout schedule and translate it into a timeline for DIB organizations, or what do you need to do when to be ready if you expect an award during either phase 1, 2, or 3 of the rollout. Noel is going to discuss how you need to think about CMMC levels and scoping within your organization and how scoping and levels are like Russian nesting dolls. The proposed rule and clarifying memo by the DoD has placed new requirements on external service providers. And I'm going to discuss how those requirements affect the managed service providers you choose to work with. Noel will discuss how those requirements will affect the cloud services and cloud service providers you choose to work with. And finally, Jim is going to discuss what organizations should expect all of this is going to cost them. You'll see that there is a question panel on the player. Please enter any questions you have for the panel. If we're unable to get to all of the questions, we'll send a follow-up email to all attendees with the questions and answers. And with that, let me pass the program over to Jim. Jim?
Oh, thanks, Stuart. Don, if you want to move to the next slide, please. So, like Stuart said, the rule, while there's been a lot of fanfare about it, mostly the changes that you'll see, especially just from CMMC 2.0 to this new 2. Whatever it is, 2.11, some are calling it, the delta there is relatively small. So much of what you would expect to see is still in there. We're still fundamentally focused on protecting the government's information. If you're a government contractor, that means that if the government's giving you stuff or asking you to create stuff, you need to protect it. That's all this really is about. They've been asking you to do that for a while, and unfortunately, contractors have been falling short. So now they're trying to make you prove that you're actually doing it. That's all. That's really all this is about. We have watered things down from 5 levels to 3, just like you would expect. The requirements are important for those that are just getting started with CMMC. This is a big one. 800-171 is the basis. NIST Special Publication 800-171 is the document that everybody needs to look to for defining what your requirements are. Everybody knows there's 110 requirements in there, but there's actually 320 assessment objectives. They are in another document called the 800-171 Alpha or A. You need to make sure you're looking in there, make sure that you're assessing yourself for your self-assessments as well as when you're preparing, make sure you're ready for all 320 of those objectives. So we saw early on that many companies weren't paying attention to that. DoD really helped reinforce that in here. But fundamentally, that's been the case for those that have been really playing along with this for a while. That should, again, not come as a big surprise. Ultimately, you need evidence. So it's not just being able to say, yes, I meet a requirement, or no, I don't meet a requirement. DoD wants you to actually have evidence, and you should expect to have that evidence collection process happening on an ongoing basis. So that idea of continuous compliance and being able to prove that you are actually doing it at any time is critical. The last thing you want to DoD and their DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, has started this new thing where they will call you on Monday and say, prove where you are today, and you have until Friday to put all of that together. If you don't have all the evidence, if you don't have everything in a well-oiled process and running efficiently, you're never going to meet those requirements, and that's going to create issues for you. So, but fundamentally, that's not a change. That has been there since actually CMMC 1.0. Level 2, you can still expect to see certification requirements. Level 3, you're still going to see certification requirements for that as well. The one wrinkle is now the government is doing those level 3 assessments. At one point, they were going to be done by third parties as well. So it's a, sorry. It is a great way to, no real changes overall. Sorry about that. If you want to go to the next slide, Don. Or at least not at that level. No major changes at that level. One thing they did do was to refine the kinds of impact that this is going to have on organizations and the numbers of organizations. So at one point, the total was 220,000. At one point, it was over 300,000. They kind of watered that down to about 220. Now it's 221,000. Couple things really important to see here. Number one, you'll hear a lot of discussion about CMMC level 2, the people that are handling controlled unclassified information. That's where most of the focus of most of the conversations, both today and just in general, is for those folks that are handling that sensitive information, and who's going to need certification. The big thing to note here is that 35% of the defense supply chain is expected to need a CMMC certification. There is this thing where you can do some basic self-assessments. That is only going to ultimately apply to about 2% of the defense supply chain. The vast majority of the companies that are handling controlled unclassified information will have to have a certification. The other thing to note is that when you get up to level 3, some folks are going to get really fixated on how you have to meet level 3 requirements. DoD currently expects only 1% of the defense supply chain to need that level 3 certification. So the big things to focus on for every contractor are level 1 and level 2. And honestly, when you're doing your implementations, start with level 1. There's actually some increased legal risk that goes along with level 1 versus level 2. It's subtle, it's minor, but it's important to understand that getting through level 1 and doing it completely and properly is really critical. It lays the foundation for everything else. And that level 1, there were some studies back in the 2020 timeframe that showed that 75% of government contractors weren't meeting those level 1 requirements. There's at least 1 or 2 of the controls that were consistently missed. So really important, make sure if you're trying to figure out how do I get started, start with level 1, do all those things, then move on to level 2. Don, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Another thing that everybody is talking about is outsourcing, and both Noel and Stuart are going to talk about this a little bit more too. That whole idea of hiring a cloud service provider, an external service provider, and I'll save it for my colleagues to go into more details. But fundamentally, DoD is reinforcing that you as the government contractor are ultimately accountable for ensuring that everything is done. You can outsource the responsibility for doing certain things, and that's all okay. But at the end of the day, if your contractor, whoever it is, MSP, MSSP, cloud provider, whatever, if they don't live up to their commitments, it's not, the government's not going to go after them. The government's going to go after you. So you really need to make sure that you are very diligent and thinking through, if you have an MSP today who is not paying attention to CMMC and is not sending folks for training and doing all the other things that really need to be done to effectively run their practice, you should be looking to somebody else. You should be looking to NeoSystems. You should be looking to other companies that are out there that have invested in and are paying active attention to CMMC, because there is a lot of additional risk on you. So, and those risks include things like suspension, debarment. There's a lot of, again, potential blowback for you, all because you've chosen to trust someone else. You want to make sure that that person that you're giving your trust to is actually going to respect that trust. So make sure you choose your vendors carefully. Don, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Drilling down a little bit deeper, if you're really new to CMMC and all of this stuff, level 1 focuses on federal contract information. What that means is any non-public information from the government that's not classified. So we'll take the classified information and set it aside because it's subject to its own set of interesting requirements. And quite frankly, most defense contractors don't handle classified information. So on that unclassified side, you're really focusing on anything that's non-public. That can be as simple as an email. So every communication, everything that's not meant for, again, for publishing on a website is considered federal contract information. There are only 15 requirements. The devil's in the details in those. There are some subtleties in it. The requirements are drawn now directly from the federal acquisition regulations, which is where those requirements are officially established. DoD's assessment guide does, for level 1, does draw some information from NIST 800-171, but as a practical matter, the requirements themselves, they've made a subtle change where now you're focusing specifically on the federal acquisition regulations and the requirements there. It's kind of a two sides of the same coin at the end of the day, but it is important to know that you're going to fixate on those 15 requirements instead of the 17 the way they were published before, if you're paying attention to this stuff back then. At level 2, you're focusing on that controlled unclassified information. That's anything from naval nuclear propulsion information and other super sensitive but not quite classified information, all the way down to more mundane but still really important stuff like social security numbers and people's names and addresses and healthcare information and other sensitive information where there's a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that says that that information has to be protected in some way. That's what this is all about, is making sure that that stuff is protected properly when the government, especially when the government is giving it to you, or if the government's asking you to collect or create that information, you got to make sure you're protecting it properly. So again, the CMMC 2.11 reinforces that you want to be looking at the requirements in not only 800-171, but the assessment guide that goes along with it, 800-171A. A little shout out to NIST, by the way, in the next version of 800-171, they have consolidated those documents down. Life gets a whole lot easier for contractors in some ways. When revision 3 becomes a thing in 2 years-ish or so. In the meantime, make sure you're looking at both documents, 800-171 and 171A. Otherwise, you're going to miss things. The DoD did a wonderful job, and the teams that they hired to help them create CMMC 1.0, to their credit, they did a lot of analysis. They actually wrote some really good stuff in the early assessment guides, and DoD is not withdrawing those. They are still around, and there's some great suggestions for how companies can, or examples for how you can create your cyber programs. Great tools. Read those documents, read the assessment guide. There's lots of good stuff in there, but ultimately the thing that everybody is going to be held accountable for is that 800, 171, and 171A. Level 3, again, that's highly sensitive CUI. We don't yet know what DoD means by that highly sensitive CUI. We're still waiting for that. There are actually 2 other sets of regulations that we're waiting for from DoD, and in addition to the stuff that published recently. So be on the lookout. There's still some things that are some moving parts that are going to play out here. Make sure that you're paying attention. Make sure that you come back to folks like us to hear what's going on, because those changes are still in effect, especially if you think you might be handling some of that really sensitive information. There's only 24 additional requirements instead of 110. It's only 24 more, so it's 134. Again, at level 3, the government is actually going to conduct that certification, and the level 3 assessment guide is something that, again, was created by DoD. It is supplemental to some stuff that NIST published as well. Don, if you want to go to the next slide. So at level 1, what's expected of you, you have to do a self-assessment. And Noel's going to touch on some of this in a bit, but from a scoping perspective, really important to understand what that means, because you may have to do multiple assessments. So you want to be careful that you're really paying attention to where that FCI sits and any differences between the FCI and CUI. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when you do that gap assessment, make sure you understand that no POAMs, no plans of action and milestones, no gaps can exist in your cyber program. So you must be doing everything properly. You're going to turn around then, and a senior member of your team is going to file something with DoD in their supplier performance risk system, or at least that's what the thing says today, what the regulation says today. You can expect to file something with DoD attesting to the fact that you meet those requirements. That is a huge amount of risk on senior management. For companies who can afford it, you should probably consider bringing in an independent third party, ideally somebody like a CMMC C3PAO, to help validate that, to help offset some of that risk for you. But big picture, what DoD is trying to do is hold senior management's feet to the fire for a lot of this stuff. Don, if you want to go to the next slide. And so what happens is, when you're getting now into that even more sensitive information, the controlled unclassified information, the companies are going to be held, again, even more accountable. There's more requirements that you have to put in place. Right now, as part of the phased rollout that DoD is expecting, they recognize that we have this sort of chicken and egg problem of there are roughly 50 certified third-party assessment organizations, or C3PAOs, out there. We have thousands, tens of thousands of contractors who need to be assessed. Unfortunately, we're not bringing in more C3PAOs because assessments haven't started. So you have this whole chicken and egg problem of not having enough C3PAOs, but not having a market. So DoD has said, okay, look, initially, when we first start this, everybody who is handling controlled unclassified information is going to have to do a self-assessment. You're going to have to score, and you're going to submit that to us. And then over time, we're going to phase in the need for those certification assessments too. And Stuart will go into some of this in more detail. But the idea is, remember that DoD actually reserves the right, or if you've seen it, DoD actually reserves the right to include certification requirements early on. There's some thought that actually we might see that happen more often than not. So, and one of the other subtle things here is those self-assessment results. You can actually submit an attestation that your company is compliant, but still have POAMs, still have plans of action and milestones. And Don, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So you have this idea of a final assessment, and then a conditional assessment. Final assessment means we've done our own gap assessment. We believe that we are meeting all of the requirements, and we're saying we're done. A conditional assessment is we've done our gap assessment. We've got most of the stuff in place. Our score is somewhere around an 88 or better, and we check a bunch of other boxes too. And so we think we're basically ready to start handling CUI. And most importantly, you are promising DoD that you will close all of those open items within 180 days. So that's a big deal. It's a relatively short time frame. You do the typical implementation time for CMMC as a whole is somewhere around 12 to 18 months. So, you're only buying yourself a little bit of extra time to be able to close those gaps. The math here is admittedly funky. You really want to use, if there are spreadsheets, there's other really cool tools that are out there that will help you track your score. You really want to trust something like that. If you're new to all of this, I would strongly recommend that you don't do the math yourself. Go grab a cool tool and do it that way. Because most of those tools will also impose all of the other math requirements here. You can't have any of the 5-point controls. You can't have any 3-point controls, any of that kind of stuff. Don, if you want to go to the next slide, please. And ultimately, this is about affirmations. And so your team can expect to affirm continued compliance. So whether you're doing the self-assessments or whether you have a certification, you are still going to have to go in every year and attest to continued compliance. So again, I talked about how senior management's feet are being held to the fire. That's really the case now. We are definitely going to be making sure that these folks are doing everything and enforcing and ensuring that everything is in place correctly. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Stuart. Oh, sorry, I had one more. Sorry, one more, Don. There we go. So the reciprocity joint surveillance. So on this one, the other thing to note is that there are ways of getting ahead of the curve. So if your company has been aggressive and you are ready now or soon for a CMMC certification, you can actually go through this joint surveillance voluntary assessment program. You can get the equivalent of a certification. And when CMMC certifications are actually being issued, DoD has said that they will make your certification retroactive to the date of your joint surveillance voluntary assessment. So you can actually jump to the head of the line with the contracting officers. There's a lot of really cool games that you can kind of play if you've been paying attention to CMMC, or if you can accelerate your adoption of it. Now is the time to do it. That is the only thing that the government is accepting as an equivalent to CMMC. They're not taking ISO, they're not taking any of the other requirements that are out there, only what they call DIBCAC high, which is what that joint surveillance voluntary assessment turns into. That's the only thing the government is really accepting. And now I'll turn it over to Stuart. Sorry about that, Stuart.
Hey, Jim, and thank you. That was a really great summary. Thank you. Donna, we can get to the next slide. Great. The CMMC 2.0 rollout is going to occur in 4 phases. And we put some nominal dates on this. The actual dates for the key milestones in the rollout aren't really known at this point, and they're going to ultimately be determined by the amount of time the DoD takes to adjudicate the comments that are being submitted between now and February 26th, and by how long the Office of Management and Budget takes to review and approve the final rule. So for purposes of this discussion, we're going to assume that the final rule is published in about a year from now, meaning that the rule would become effective 60 days after that, or in March of 2025. And that would be the start of what's referred to as phase 1. Phase 2 would start 6 months later, or in September of 2025. Phase 3, 6 months after that, or March of 2026. And phase 4, a year later, in March of 2027. So if you're expecting an award during phase 1, or a renewal between phase 1 between March 2025 and August of 2025, you must complete and submit a self-assessment with a minimum score of 88 of 110 as a condition of award. And again, none of the POAMs items can be on that restricted list that Jim referred to. And additionally, all those POAM items need to be resolved within 180 days of award. And again, this is in recognition that the C3PAO community needs to build, and there's not going to be an adequate supply of C3PAOs during this initial period of phase 1. So if you're expecting an award during phase 2, or between September of 2025 and February of 2026, you must complete a conditional assessment, or a level 2 C3PAO assessment, again, with a minimum score of 88 out of 110, as a condition of award. Again, no of the POAM items can be on this restricted list. Again, this is what Jim referred to as a conditional assessment. And then any of the POAM items need to be remediated, and they need to be validated by a C3PAO within 120 or within 180 days of that time frame. And if you're expecting an award during phase 3 or phase 4, anytime after March of 2026, you must have completed a level 2 C3PAO assessment and received a level 2 certification to be award eligible, meaning that you've got a score of 110 out of 110. If you went through an assessment and had POAM items, those POAM items would have need to have been remediated, that would have needed to have been validated by a C3PAO in order to be eligible for award as of March 2026 or any time thereafter. And you kind of think about it and say, okay, well, March 1st, 2026, it seems like a long way away. What's the hurry? But why don't we take a look, Don, if we can get to the next slide, what's required to receive an award by that period of time. So if you're looking to receive an award on March 1st, 2026, for example, you'll need to have completed a C3PAO assessment, and that can take roughly 30 calendar days from the start to the end of the process. And then you're going to need to resolve any POAM items and then have those remediated items validated again by a C3PAO. And while the proposed rule states that you've got 180 days for POAM resolution and validation, in this chart, we've assumed that you can accomplish that in 90 days. And again, that's assuming that a C3PAO is going to be available on your schedule. And that's really a big assumption. I've seen some of the questions in the chat about this as well, that today there's only 50 authorized C3PAOs on the Cyber AV marketplace. There's roughly 76,000 organizations that are going to be seeking a level 2 certification. And kind of this dynamic of how many C3PAOs versus organizations that need to be assessed can really become a fly in the ointment. So let's go back to this. To be CMMC certified not later than March 1st of 2026, the latest your assessment could begin is November 1st of 2025 to allow 30 days for the assessment and 90 days for POAM resolution. If we assume that the assessment preparation, kind of gathering and curating all the evidence, developing an in-brief, et cetera, all those things are going to take 90 days, and that's, again, not unreasonable, then your environment is going to need to be fully compliant not later than August 1st of 2025. So for a very small organization with a simple environment, the process of satisfying all of the technical and non-technical requirements, it can take as little as 3 months. But that's pretty unusual. For a larger, more complex organization, the process of getting ready can take as long as 18 months. And if we assume the average organization is going to require 12 months to be able to satisfy all of the technical and the non-technical requirements, then they're going to need to begin that process not later than August of 2024. In the more complex organization that may need as much as 18 months, well, they're going to need to start right now. And so if we look at it, March 1st, 2026 is really not that far away. Don, if we can get to the next slide. So if there's an organization that's expecting a phase 2 award in September of 2025, the C3PAO assessment only needs to be completed by that day. All that's needed is a conditional certification. POAM resolution and retesting can follow that. But following the same logic, if a company needs 1 year to address all the requirements, which again is not unusual, they're going to need to start in May of this year. In a complex organization that may need as much as 18 months, well, the best thing they can do is go find a time machine, kind of revisit 2023 and get started. So I think the key point in all of this is that the preparation takes time. And while the rollout timeline may seem like it provides plenty of time to get ready, it really doesn't. And organizations need to understand that, in general, if you haven't started preparing for your C3PAO assessment or your self-assessment, then now is not too late. And with that, let me toss this over to Noelle.
Thank you so much, Stuart. So this has been such great information from both you and Jim talking about the different levels and what it means. Well, then what do you do? How do you implement that? What do you do with that information? It's great to know a timeline, but if I'm a small machine shop, in Illinois, do I even know which level of CMMC I'm going to have? So this is a very, very high level. Just ask yourself these questions, because remember, everybody out there who has either a prime or a subcontract with the DoD is already subject to something, either the FAR clause or the DFAR 7012 clause, or possibly both. So review your contracts. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people who don't look at their contracts. So please, please look at your contract. Jim is nodding. He understands. Please look at your contract. That means if you're a subcontractor, look at your prime contract. You have a prime that you're working with. What is your contract state? Do they have cybersecurity flow down requirements? They have them from the DoD, but make sure they're in your contract as well, and make sure you understand them. If you're a prime, you need to make sure that if you double check any of your DoD contracts, because if one DoD contract has a 7012 clause, you are on the hook for 800-171. So that's something that a lot of people, I think, get confused by. Well, I only have this little tiny contract. It's nothing. It'll be fine. No, if you have one, you're in it for everything. So if you do have a DFAR 7012 clause, you will most likely need CMMC level 2, and you are most likely, like we showed before, going to need an assessment done by a C3PAO. That means that all those 110 controls apply to you, but also all the level 1 apply to you as well. Like Jim was saying, that is level 2 builds on level 1, level 3 builds on level 2, and level 1. If you are level 2, you can't just forget about FCI. Jim made an excellent point. This is a huge spot of risk for a lot of different organizations out there, because they think, okay, cool, I've got CUI covered. FCI is not, I don't need to worry about that. You absolutely do. Those 15 requirements in that FAR clause are directly applicable to FCI. So make sure that you're checking that box as well. Let's say you don't have a 7012 clause at this time. Double check with your contracting officer, because you'd be amazed at how many times something will get lost in translation between your contracting officer and you. So please make sure, double check with them. If they also confirm, nope, you're never going to have to deal with CUI, we're not going to have to work on that, no issues, then you absolutely still have to do level 1. And that is that FAR clause that we talked about, those 15 individual cybersecurity requirements. You have to make sure that you do that. Again, make sure that that FCI is protected just like the CUI would be protected if you had that. And if remember, you're still expected to cover all the levels below whatever level you have. So do not just assume that because, okay, well, I've done level 2, I guess I'm doing level 1 as well. Make sure to actually go out of your way to double check that. And now it's over to Stuart, I think.
Hey, Noelle, thanks. And let me just ask you a question about that.
Certainly.
Where, for the scope of your federal contract information and the scope of your controlled and classified information don't necessarily need to be the same, do they? I mean, that FCI can reside in other places. So
absolutely.
For that, that's a separate assessment?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So a level 1, or, for the FAR clause, those 15 cybersecurity requirements that are the baseline, the basic coverage at this point is what it's called. Those have to be done in accordance with what those different cybersecurity requirements are asking of you. But no, you don't have to scope it the same way you scope CUI, because it's a different kind of information. In fact, FCI is usually more prevalent. Like Jim had mentioned earlier, FCI can literally be emails back and forth with your contracting officer. I mean, if you have emails going back and forth with somebody in the government talking about your contract, that is FCI. That is federal contract information. There's a lot of different communications that have to be accounted for. So yeah, it can definitely have a much broader scope than level 2 can, just because of the fact that it includes so many different types of communication regarding federal contracting.
Good, thanks. So kind of moving on, and I think Don, the next slide then. You talked earlier about how the proposed rule puts specific requirements for external service providers, generally lumped as managed service providers and cloud service providers. Managed service providers, really play an important role in supporting the IT functions for companies of all sizes across the DIB. There was a recent article that said about 80% of all organizations in the DIB rely on managed service providers. But the frequency is certainly much greater with small and medium businesses who may not have all of the technical expertise, the compliance expertise, or the security expertise, that they need to support their IT environment. And, managed service providers also support the cybersecurity and regulatory requirements for those companies. And as we expect to see technology continue to evolve, as regulatory requirements continue to expand and get more complex, we can expect that companies' reliance on managed service providers is going to continue to increase. And as we mentioned, to date, there have been no requirements for external service providers to represent themselves as capable of supporting the 52.204-21 and the 800.171 requirements for their clients, or that they even understand what those requirements are. And so organizations who haven't carefully vetted managed service providers or potential MSPs really are at risk at having a non-compliant environment, as Jim pointed out. So the final rule, or the draft of the final rule, or I'm sorry, proposed rule, provides requirements for external service providers that are used by organizations to address NIST 800-171 requirements. But unfortunately, we see the proposed rule raises as many questions as it seems to answer. The first, the proposed rule is defining an external service provider as external people, technology, or facilities that an organization utilizes for the provision and the management of comprehensive IT and or cybersecurity services on behalf of the organization. And for an external service provider to be in scope, it can either be a CUI asset or a security protection asset. A security protection asset meaning consultants who are providing cybersecurity services, a managed service provider or managed service provider personnel who are providing system maintenance, or enterprise system network administrators. The requirement is that an external service provider other than a cloud service provider, Noel is going to talk to us about those, must be assessed at the CMMC level equal to or higher than its customers, and at level 2 must have a final certification assessment, meaning no POAMs to be acceptable. So what this implies is that if you need to certify at level 2, the managed service provider you're using must already have a CMMC level 2 certification. So there's a couple of problems. I mean, today, there really isn't a means for a managed service provider to have a final certification assessment. In fact, today there are no CMMC certification assessments and won't be until the rule is final and enacted. And so we do have a little bit of kind of a chicken and an egg situation. How can an organization seeking assessment or an organization seeking certification be assessed if they use a managed service provider, if their managed service provider hasn't been able to go through the process and received a CMMC certification ahead of them? And some of the challenges that, with few exceptions, MSPs are not government contractors. You're not going to find a managed service provider registered in SAM.gov. They're not going to have a cage code. And at least today, they don't have a means of being able to record their score in the supplier performance risk system, or SPRS. And so again, this poses real challenges for an organization seeking certification that uses a managed service provider. If an organization is among the first that is required to CMMC certified, how are they going to be able to pass that assessment if their managed service provider has not been already assessed and received their CMMC certification? So clearly this is an issue that the DoD and government is going to need to address. And until managed service providers can be certified, the DoD may elect to have them included as part of your certification assessment, again, responding to those controls directly that they have responsibility for during your assessment, and they having to demonstrate that they satisfy each and every one of those requirements where they've been identified as responsible in your SSP. So, what can you do in the meantime? If you're working with a managed service provider or an MSSP, or you're about to select a managed service provider or a managed system or security service provider, so I suggest you ask a couple of questions. First, ask whether they've successfully completed a NIST 800-171 assessment, and have they scored 110. If they've completed an assessment and not achieved a score of 110, ask them when they plan to have a score of 110 and ask them for the documentation. Again, to Jim's point, you're the one that is ultimately responsible for ensuring the service providers that you're working with satisfy these requirements. And if you ask those requirements and they respond, what is NIST 800-171? It's probably time to look for, a new service provider. There's also similar challenges, for organizations that are only handling FCI. So again, strictly by the requirement, if you only need to self-assess at level 1, but are using an external service provider or a managed service provider, that managed service provider needs to have certified or self-assessed at level 1. And so similar questions concerning how a managed service provider supporting level 1 will complete and submit their own level 1 self-assessment. But again, it's important. If you need to self-assess at level 1, you are responsible for assuring that the responsibilities that your managed service provider assumes on your behalf are being done in a manner that satisfies the requirement or the assessment criteria in NIST 800-171. If your external service provider is managing endpoints, are they updating the antivirus or endpoint protection software as new releases are available? Are they performing patching in a timely manner? If they claim they are, but they haven't, and you subsequently self-attest that you've satisfied all requirements, then your organization and the corporate officer who has signed the attestation could both be liable under the False Claims Act. So net, even at level 1, you're responsible for ensuring any external service provider has in fact satisfied the requirements they are responsible for. So some real challenges placing obligations on you as a consequence of the obligations on your managed service provider. Noelle, I bet there are similar requirements on cloud service providers.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. So thank you. This is perfect to segue here. So although the external service providers and managed service providers, we don't have, like Stuart pointed out, we don't really have a clear, super clear guidance on how that's going to work. The CSPs, on the other hand, cloud service providers, for example, like PreVeil, are responsible for either attesting to FedRAMP attestation. So that is going through the FedRAMP process to be able to actually work as a, like, for example, if PreVeil was going to go through an authority to operate in the US government, we would have to have a sponsor from the government, and it takes about 18 to 24 months, depending on how long the actual FedRAMP office takes. It also takes a very long time to get all of the controls implemented because we talked a lot about NIST 800-171, but the controls that a CSP has to address are actually 853, which is currently 325 controls that have to be addressed. There are quite a few of them, and I think about 1,007 objectives, if I'm not mistaken. So it is a huge endeavor. So this document you see here, this very tiny little memo right here, came out on January 4th of this year. So this is brand new. And it states an actual definition for equivalency to FedRAMP. What I just explained, the FedRAMP process, is if you're going through an official authority to operate in the government. If you have a government sponsor and the government has a need for your particular product. However, what if you're a cloud service provider that doesn't have any sort of government contract and doesn't have a sponsor and doesn't have a need necessarily to work in the government? What do you do? So there was a word, equivalency, that is in 7012. It states that if you, as an organization seeking certification, if you are using a cloud service provider, let's assume as a CUI asset, so in support of processing, transmitting, and storing CUI itself, then they have to be either FedRAMP authorized, going through the process I just described, or equivalent. Well, up until January 4th of 2024, the word equivalent was never defined. So much like the managed service providers, we also were sort of, okay, well, what does equivalency mean? We don't understand, and very much a chicken and the egg there as well. Well, now we actually do have definitions. So this memo that you see here actually discusses the different requirements that a CSP or a cloud service provider must meet in order to be considered equivalent. I will tell you that it allows for no POAMs. Now, in the FedRAMP process, if, for example, a company were to go through the official process through the government, getting a sponsor and getting an authority to operate, they most certainly could have POAMs. However, the equivalency means 0. So those 325 controls, 1,007 objectives, there cannot be a single one that is not met at the time that you were using this cloud service provider. So that is a huge effort for a cloud service provider. I say that as one who has done it, and it is a lot of work, and it took us several years to get there. So if you are looking for a cloud service provider, much like what Stuart was just discussing about when you're shopping for a managed service provider, have that conversation. If they don't even know that this memo exists, that's a problem. They need to have an understanding of that. And this is if they don't have an authority to operate. So for example, usually the big companies, Microsoft and AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, Google, those types of companies usually do. However, a lot of other cloud service providers probably don't, because they don't necessarily have a need to. So they will need to make sure that they have every single piece of that memo checked off. So make sure as the OSC, again, unfortunately, the onus falls on you as an organization. It is up to you to make the decision if that cloud service provider has offered enough information to you to make you feel like they've checked all the necessary boxes on that memo. That is not up to anybody other than the organization who's going to be using that cloud service provider. So what that means is that if you, let's say that you don't look at anything for that cloud service provider and you just assume that they're fine, the DoD could come down on you and say, you didn't follow this memo. And that's where you end up, again, having False Claims Act, which is a whole other thing that you don't want to be a part of. So if you have not checked out the FedRAMP equivalency memo, I know that we're talking about the new proposed rule, but this is also so incredibly important. Please make sure to read that and look it over. It's very important that we all understand what's in there. It also includes a section where you have to actually submit, as the cloud service provider, you have to submit your body of evidence, which is outlined in the equivalency memo. You have to submit that to the DIBCAC, the DoD's cybersecurity assessment branch. They have to look over that and then sort of give you a blessing. So there's a lot of different pieces of this and a lot of different moving parts. So please make sure that you do your due diligence and protect yourself. Be familiar with that memo and make sure that any cloud service provider you use that doesn't have an authority to operate in the US government, you can check that out, by the way, on the FedRAMP marketplace and find that. If they don't have anything on the marketplace, make sure to ask them these questions. Ask them about this memo. Do they understand what it means? What are they doing for equivalency? Do they have any communication with the DoD and DIBCAC to be able to understand this? There's a lot of information in this memo, so I highly suggest making sure that you're familiarize yourself with it. And now I'll turn it over to Jim.
And just before Jim jumps in, there was one question that Caitlin asked that has come up from a number of people about what is the deadline? When do I need to be ready? And I think the point that I was trying to make during the timeline is that once the rule goes into effect, and if we assume that may be March of 2025, then it is effect for everyone upon their next contract award or renewal. So that if you have a contract award that happens after March 2025, or a renewal, you're going to be subject to the requirements. And again, depending whether it's in phase 1, 2, or 3, we'll say what it is that you need to have done, whether it's a self-assessment, whether it's a conditional assessment, or whether it's a certification assessment. So Jim, over to you.
Yeah, and I think, Stuart, that ties in really nicely with the topic of costs. I want to just kind of touch on that a little bit further too, and or expand on that a little bit more. Remember, it takes 12 to 18 months. So if you haven't started this process, you really want to get started now. I mentioned before, there's 3 moving parts to this. There's the one that was just published, the one regulation was just published. There's 2 other regulations that are coming out. DoD is going to try to coordinate the release of all 3 of them so they become effective on the same date. And that's where there's like some fuzziness in some of these dates that Stuart and Noelle and I have been talking about. But fundamentally, you've got probably about a year, maybe if you're kind of lucky, a year and a half to get this done, which is just about how much time you need to get this done. So get started now. There were stories back in the day that this wasn't going to happen. It is very clear that that CMMC is not going away. You really want to get this stuff done. So what's it going to cost? Well, I'm going to give you my favorite lawyer answer of it depends. It depends on where you are, how much you've already been doing. If you're starting from scratch and you're a little company, can you do this for $10,000? Probably not. It's going to cost you probably more than that. There are wonderful solutions like PreVeil. There are wonderful providers like NeoSystems who can help accelerate that process for you. There's really cool tools like FutureFeed too. They can help you with this. But the idea is, there are ways that you can get there faster, but not necessarily cheaper. There are different ways to do things depending on what you're doing that, again, something like PreVeil is less expensive than some of the other options that are out there. If it works for you, it's a wonderful solution. So implementation costs can vary anywhere from, I've heard some small businesses say they were able, who've gone through like the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program, who've said that it's cost them somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 just for the implementation piece. I've heard other numbers of closer to 100 plus for decent size, not huge companies, but for decent sized companies that their implementation costs are approaching that $75,000 to $100,000 range. So it is a non-trivial thing. If you want to be able to work that into your budget over the next year and a half, got to get started now. If you don't want that to all hit you all at once, now is the time to do it. On the other side of the fence, there's the assessment costs. And again, it's going to depend. Right off the bat, there is a huge demand for C3PAOs right now. So as a practical matter, to be perfectly honest, we are not seeing a huge level of competition for price. So right now, the numbers that I've heard are somewhere around $40,000 to $60,000 for an assessment. Smaller businesses, well-structured programs, et cetera, you might actually be able to even reduce those costs a little bit more, but that's kind of rough order of magnitude what a certification assessment is costing right now. So you're looking at investing somewhere around $100,000 to $200,000 by the time you're done, all in with deploying new technology, et cetera, as well as putting in place business processes and getting that certification. If you have DoD contracts and it's lucrative for you to do this, by all means, this is a great thing. And quite frankly, while DoD is at the forefront and pushing everything, kind of feels like they're cramming it down everybody's throats. The only reason they're doing this is because they see the threats that are actually out there, and they see how hard all of their contractors that aren't you are getting hit by our adversaries on a daily basis. If you want to survive long-term as a business, you should be making similar investments regardless of whether you are a DoD contractor or not. So, it's not cheap, but unfortunately, this is the reality of the world that we live in until we as a society get better at cybersecurity. I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's, I think that's really important for folks to understand. Stuart, I'll turn it back to you. I'm happy to continue pontificating, but I think folks would probably rather hear answers to some of the questions or some other stuff that you had in mind.
Probably, and just, with respect to the cost point, I mean, that there are additional internal costs that organizations certainly need to dedicate people to developing policies and procedures, to implementing those policies and procedures. There's not just the cost of becoming compliant, but there's an ongoing cost of operating those procedures and maintaining compliance. And then there's the whole issue of allowable cost, or what can be charged back to the government, which is in itself probably its own hour discussion. But
we'd be here a while, yeah.
Just to point out that some of those costs, can be recovered. So I know we've got a ton of questions that have come in. We're not going to get to them all.
Before you move to that, I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned, that internal, those policies and procedures that you're creating. I completely agree with you. It is costly and it is painful, to be perfectly honest. Yep. I used to do that. I used to guide people through that process. Having to sit down and formalize a process that you used to just wing, it takes time. And all of a sudden there's nuances and things that you never really thought of until you started to write them down. What you will find is that after you come out the other end of that, your company is better. You are more efficient, you run better, you can actually delegate decision-making authority down to other people. There's all sorts of benefits to having done that, but it is not an easy process.
Absolutely. And it's not about compliance. It's about security. Doing that is going to make your organization more secure. And again, you manage that there are shorter paths, and working with a good managed service provider or a good partner in other areas can help you in terms of developing those policies and procedures and guiding your organization through that process.
And so, really, really quick, Stuart, I did want to make a point too, just for everybody out there. I know we've been talking about the proposed rule, but these are requirements now. If you have a 7012 clause today, you're already expected to have been doing this. So we're talking about a timeline for CMMC. That's only verifying what you're already expected to be doing. So that's the other thing too. I mean, we're talking about timelines. You are technically already behind the 8 ball if you haven't started yet, because of the fact if you have a 7-day 12 clause in your contract, which is another reason to be really familiar with your contract and know what's in there and what you're responsible for. So that's also something I just wanted to be really clear with everybody, because we hadn't said that yet.
Right. So yeah, CMMC is not requirements. It is a enforcement mechanism. The requirement
Exactly.
been here since 2017, I think. So I said a lot of questions. What we're going to do is we will create answers and send an email to everybody who is attending or is registered for the webinar, along with a link to the replay for this. We can try to get to a couple of these, knowing that there may be some people that need to drop off. Just ahead of getting to the questions done, I do want to thank Jim and Noel for participating today, and certainly to thank FutureFeed and PreVeil to joining NeoSystems in sponsoring this event today. So Don, I'm sure maybe you can pick out a couple of the more common questions. Again, we'll send out answers to all of the questions in an email.
Sure, Stuart, thanks. You're right. There were very many questions submitted, and I did pick out a few that I think would be of interest to the audience. Jim, I think this first one is right down your alley. If I have a conditional certification at the time of my award and I'm unable to fix all my POAM items in 180 days, what happens? How will this be enforced, and what are the consequences?
So the fun part is, again, my favorite lawyer answer of it depends. For the most part, if you don't have your certification in 180 days, the government can terminate your contract, can come after you for false claims, can come after you for all sorts of other things as well. So as a practical matter, you really want to get it done. Now, so that's the legal side of things. On the other side, the business piece of this, if you're down to having one open item and you can really prove that to the program manager and all of that, are there ways to possibly get a little bit of time? Maybe. I suspect that DoD will not take kindly to giving those kinds of waivers or extensions, but maybe. I wouldn't count on them.
Thanks, Jim. Noel, I think this next question is speaking to something you covered earlier.
Sure.
Since the level 1 controls are included in level 2, if I get level 2 certified, do I still need to do a level 1 assessment?
So you wouldn't have to do a level 1 assessment, but you still have to do a self-assessment every year anyway. So you're going to have to attest every single year at level 1 and level 2 as to where you're at in the SPUR system. So that's the supplier risk management system we talked about earlier. So you're going to have to make sure that you put that in every year and assess yourself there. Yes, those 15 controls are wrapped up into level 2, but be really, really sure that you double check in the FAR and make sure that you are actually reading every little tiny bit and getting every little piece of it, because that is what you're going to get assessed against. So yes, you should be fine with that assessment. However, be really sure to check in the level 1 and make sure that you look at that FAR clause specifically.
Great.
I think, well, just a big thing on that is to make sure that the scope actually overlaps, that your
Yes.
UI and
Also
FCI
true. That is an excellent point. Yeah.
Otherwise,
Excellent
you're
point.
still gonna have to do it. Yep.
That's actually an excellent point. So that's very true. If your FCI is not in the same place with your CUI and you have a different scope for that FCI, like if you have, for example, a lot of our customers have an enclave of CUI, so it's all kind of in its little bubble. If your FCI is floating around all over the place, that's a much bigger scope. So you could conceivably have to have, to Jim's point, 2 different assessments. Now, if you keep all your FCI in the same place with the same procedures as your CUI, you're probably going to be fine. But yes, that's an excellent point. If you have FCI all over the place, you might want to think about maybe, consolidating it with your CUI. So then that way you don't have to end up conceivably having 2 different assessments.
Right.
Great point. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, it's kind of that image of the Russian nesting doll.
Yes.
The FCI is the big one. The CUI is the little one that kind
Absolutely.
of inside of that. So I do see that we are at the top of the hour, and again, I really want to appreciate everybody for joining us today. As I said, that we will follow up with an email and also with contact information for the speakers. If you have specific questions for any one of us, or questions about the services that either of our organizations provide and how we might support and help you as you go through your CMMC journey. So again, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Noel.